Order, order. We start with questions. Secretary of State for Housing, Community and Local Government, Chris Coghlan.
Number one, please, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'll take question 1 and 12 together. Through the revised National Planning Policy Framework, this Government has strengthened the existing system of developer contributions to ensure that new developments provide the necessary infrastructure communities expect and deserve, including health services. And we will robustly hold developers to account in delivering on their obligations and will support local planning authorities to do so.
Coghlan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Westvale Park, in my constituency, is a new housing development of 1,500 homes. They've been waiting 7 years for a GP surgery. The existing GPs cannot expand their capacity. So will the Secretary of State meet with me to discuss how we can ensure that Westvale Park gets its GP that it's been promised, and also the other associated infrastructure and primary healthcare services on new developments across my constituency?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I sympathise with the honourable gentleman, and that's why this Government has said that infrastructure must come as part of our 1.5 million homes, and the Housing Minister will be happy to meet with him.
Maguire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Cornish house prices far exceed local wages, and in areas like Rock and St Mimber, 40% of the houses are second homes. Meanwhile, more than 3,000 homes are set to be built in towns like Bodmin by 2030, where the only GP surgery building is currently running at 150% capacity, despite the promise of a new building for years. Will the Minister please ensure that national planning guidance mandates primary care and education infrastructure is put in place before developments are started, preventing developers from later breaking their promises?
Well, again, Mr. Speaker, I sympathise with the honourable gentleman. As I say, this Government is absolutely committed to ensure that we get the infrastructure, and development is truly plan-led system, and the policy framework is meant to do that, and we intend to consult on future policy changes, including a set of national policies for decision-making this spring.
Clive.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Government produced new guidance about building on green belt sites, particularly the golden rules about having sufficient infrastructure in place for health, education and transport. Sheffield now has to provide sites in the green belt to hit its housing targets at the request of the Planning Inspectorate. Will she make arrangements for the Planning Minister to meet with the Leader of the Council and local MPs to discuss how these arrangements can be delivered, and to liaise with her colleagues in other departments to make sure the resources are available to enable it to happen?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can do better than that. The Housing Minister's going on Thursday.
Catherine Atkinson, then.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When new housing was built in Mickleover under the last Government, residents were promised time and time again that they would get a new GP surgery, and it never happened. What can this Government do to ensure that when new homes are built, residents have the GP access that they need?
Again, Mr. Speaker, I totally sympathise. This is why I think a lot of the time people have resisted some of these planning applications. It's why our Government is absolutely committed through the revised National Planning Policy Framework to ensure that the infrastructure, including GP surgeries, are available when new housing is built.
Shadow Minister David Simmonds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know the planning system is very good through the Section 106 agreement process at levying funds for new NHS facilities. But NHS Property Services has not always been effective at building them out on time. So what assurance can she give the House that across government there will be an appropriate level of focus in ensuring that NHS Property Services deliver the facilities that planning has secured?
Well, the Shadow Minister is absolutely right, and it was his government that didn't do enough in this area. We've said that we will strengthen Section 106 planning obligations, and we've also set up a unit within my department to ensure that we hold them to account and that we work across government to ensure that that infrastructure is built.
Thanks, Stevens.
Number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not least because we will only begin construction of the next generation of new towns toward the end of this Parliament, the Government has been clear that they will deliver over and above the targets produced by the standard method. We will, of course, keep under review how the Task Force forthcoming recommendations on new towns interact with housing targets across England.
Blake Stevenson.
Mr. Speaker, communities in mid-Bedfordshire have always done their bit to take new housing. but continued pressure to build is chipping away at our beautiful countryside and the historic character of our towns and villages. Will the Minister assure communities like mine that the new Towns Taskforce can't hit us with a double whammy of house building?
Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. The independent expert task force chaired by Sir Michael Lyons will be submitting its final report to us in the summer, and as such we have absolutely no idea which locations it will recommend to ministers for decision. But we have been clear, as I said, that when it comes to new towns, our ambition is that they will contribute over and above the targets produced by the standard method, but we obviously want to make sure that the right incentives are in place to support proactive local authorities like his from coming forward with these large-scale new communities.
Neil Duncan-Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that future generations of older people are unlikely to have had generous pensions or even to have been homeowners during their working lives. Will the Minister confirm, therefore, if housing targets will include specific reference to older people's housing and the growing need for age-appropriate accommodation?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. I'd say two things for him. Firstly, the Older People's Housing Task Force recently reported we're weighing up its recommendations. We've also made clear through the National Planning Policy Framework, Mr. Speaker, that we do expect local authorities to take into account the types of tenure and homes that they need for their local areas, and it's through local plans that are the primary way that need for different types of housing for different demographics should be brought forward.
Paul Davies.
Question number 3, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our department is in regular dialogue with the Department for Transport and with regional mayors on how best to support local transport infrastructure investment, including the Ashton-under-Lyne project. With our decision to finally grasp the nettle and support a mass transit system, this government is now providing unprecedented levels of investment for the region.
Paul Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Ashton-under-Lyne connects Kirklees, Barnsley and Sheffield. Single track sections constrain capacity and present reliability issues. On the day that the previous Conservative government announced Network North money was going to be spent on potholes in London, 3 out of 6 services running over a 4-hour period were cancelled on the Ashton-under-Lyne. Does the Minister agree that the proposed improvements will boost connectivity, economic growth, education and healthcare? And will the Minister meet me and my colleagues to discuss advancing this project?
Minister.
I'm grateful for that question. I want to thank my honourable friend for raising these important points. I totally agree with him that improved connectivity is essential for places to thrive, and this is a point that Mayor Tracy Brabin makes to me frequently, and I can happily say that the case for West Yorkshire is heard loud and clear, and of course I'd be happy to hold such a meeting.
Mayor Cross.
Question number 4, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite the difficult fiscal context, the autumn budget we provided stability for legacy levelling up projects, now called local growth funding, prioritising expenditure on the programmes that most directly support the 5 missions that this government was elected on. The government will set out its long-term vision for local growth at the upcoming spending review.
Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Provisional Local Government Finance Settlement for 2025-26 introduces changes to the previous methodology for the then levelling up funding for categorising areas of priority need. The Rural Services Network have highlighted concerns and disparities that shift funding away from rural and coastal communities to urban areas. Can the Minister assure the House that any new funding formula will adequately address the unique challenges of rural and coastal communities, and will he commit to publishing the criteria by which future levelling up funding decisions will be made?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've been very clear that for local growth funding, we want to move away from the old model that was competitive funding pots and beauty parades. It was short-term. It was based on central criteria. What I can assure the honourable lady is that the model that they get from this government will be longer term, will be allocative, will have more flexibility, more local leadership, and of course will be targeted at those communities who need it the most.
Mayor Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I first thank the Secretary of State for visiting Preston last week to attend this year's Convention of the North. It was a fantastic event and reinvigorated the case for northern investment to be a key determinant in government decisions. In this vein, could the Secretary of State or the Minister outline what conversations she's having with departmental colleagues to ensure the opportunity of investing in the North is fully realised and understood?
Minister.
I'm grateful for that question. I know my right honourable friend enjoyed her visit. our ministry is very clear that, of course, we have a crucial role to play in devolution, but that it's a whole government venture. So we are having those conversations with colleagues frequently about how to crowd in the important policy interventions they're making to make sure that our communities across the country have the tools and resources they need to shape their place.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question 5, please.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government recognises the considerable financial strain that opaque and unfair fees and charges are placing on leaseholders across the country. As she will know, on the 21st of November last year, I made a written ministerial statement setting out the steps the government intends to take to provide leaseholders with greater rights, powers and protections over their homes by implementing those reforms to the leasehold system already in statute, as well as to progress the wider set of reforms necessary to end the feudal leasehold system for good.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you. I welcome this Labour government getting a grip on the feudal racket which enslaves leaseholders to ever-rising management fees and ground rents, making it impossible to pay and impossible to move. Would the Minister provide transition arrangements to cap these costs while ensuring that all new development, even if soon to be in planning like on York Central, can transition to common hold as soon as the law changes?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. The government has no plans to cap service charges for tenants and leaseholders, given this would prevent necessary funds being raised for legitimate purposes. We do plan to tackle unregulated and affordable ground rent provisions through legislation. And when it comes to common hold, Mr. Speaker, as the white paper that is published today makes clear, we want to make the process of converting to common hold as easy as possible. And we'll set out proposals in the draft leasehold and common hold reform bill to be published later this year.
Lee Dillon.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the government's announcement today on changes to leasehold and the introduction of common hold, but thousands of leaseholders across the country are still crippled with high service charges, but also fail in delivery, and honourable members across this House, I'm sure, will have their inboxes full with complaints from constituents, particularly around first port management companies. So what can the government do to hold individual management companies accountable for the services that they deliver to our residents?
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that question. As he will know, we do intend to bring into force this year the provisions of the Leasehold and Reform Act 2024 designed to drive up the transparency of service charges so that leaseholders can more easily challenge them if they consider them to be unreasonable. When it comes to managing agents, Mr. Speaker, we do intend to strengthen the regulation around them, imposing minimum standards, for example, around qualifications. I'd say to any managing agent, and no members across the House have been holding them to account, that they should improve their performance in light of those changes coming forward in the near future.
Chair of the Select Committee, Florence Ashton-under-Lyne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his comments over the weekend. We really do need to make sure we abolish those new leaseholds, and the reality, as he knows, is that leaseholders have been promised this many a time before. And yet many of leaseholders will be going to sleep tonight with only little sigh of relief because those bills will continue to come. Can the Minister outline, he's mentioned the Green Paper, can he outline what the status of existing leaseholders will be when these measures to end leasehold will finally come forward?
Minister.
I thank the Chair of the Select Committee for that question. In as simple a way as I can, Mr. Speaker, let me explain what we want to do. And as the White Paper makes clear, we are going to ban the sale of new leasehold flats so that common hold becomes the default tenure. We are going to ensure that the process of conversion is as simple as possible so that those leaseholders in existing leasehold blocks who want to make that change can do so as simply as possible. But those who don't want to make that change, we have to ensure that they have the powers, rights and protections over their homes that provide them with that immediate relief she talks about.
Joshua Reynolds.
Speaker, could the Minister outline the steps that the government is taking to help those leaseholders with doubling ground rent who now feel trapped and unable to remortgage or sell their properties without a massive cost to change their leases, which I know from personal experience can lead up to five-figure sums?
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that question. I well recognise the problem, and as he will probably know, historically ground rents were very nominal sums, often peppercorn sums. Over the last 20 years, we have seen a very different system develop. We have committed, and we will honour that commitment, to taking action on unregulated, unaffordable ground rents through legislation, and we'll provide further details in due course.
Charlie Jewest.
Question number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the importance of business rates to both local government finance and local communities, particularly our high streets, our two departments regularly engage on these matters. Pubs are eligible for the Retail, Hospitality and Leisure Relief Scheme, and for 25-26, pubs will benefit from a 40% relief on their bills, up to a cash cap of £110,000. From 26-27, the government intends to introduce a permanently lower rate for qualifying retail, hospitality and leisure businesses, including pubs, and these rates will be set by the Chancellor at the 2025 autumn statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The highest pub in the Yorkshire Wolds, the Wolds Inn at Huggett, is a great success story. And, Mr. Speaker, I'd be delighted to buy you a pint there next time you find yourself on the right side of the Pennines. But like many pubs in my constituency, it faces a crippling rise in non-domestic rates at a time when margins are very, very tight. Now, local pubs are not just businesses, they are much-loved community assets. So will the Minister reverse this tax grab and start supporting the great British local?
Yeah. I return as a missionary. I'll bear that in mind, Minister.
Well, I mean, I'll say if it's intended to be a tax grab on pubs, we're not doing a very good job of it. Because when the permanent scheme comes in, 99% of pubs who are under the £500,000 threshold will benefit from the new scheme. We absolutely recognise the importance of our community pubs, both in terms of propping up the community and giving places to meet, and also in terms of the economy and the good jobs that they provide.
Chris Webb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Arnfield Club in my constituency is a fantastic local boozer that's run and was created by Blackpool FC supporters. Venues like the Arnfield are the beating heart of our town, providing jobs and bringing local communities together. What steps will the Minister be doing to ensure a bright and sustainable future for clubs like the Arnfield?
Minister.
Well, I thank him for the work that he's doing to champion pubs in his constituency. Like all of us, he recognises just how important they are, of course, to the economy, but probably more than that, to local communities. So, of course, the government can do a lot on business rates, and we're on with that, but also things like the community right to buy, and giving the community the right to step in when pubs, unfortunately, in some cases, might face closure as part of that package.
Stephen Gaffins.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My officials and I continue to work with counterparts, including the Scotland Office and colleagues in the devolved governments, to develop and deliver the Reform Long-Term Plan for Towns. I was delighted to visit Arbroath myself earlier this year. I was blown away by the quality of their consultation as well as the boldness of their plans, and would commend the leadership of Peter Stirling and the rest of the Town Board.
Stephen Gaffins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I firstly put on record my thanks to the Minister for his visit to Arbroath. It was good of him to do that, and joining him and congratulate Peter Stirling and members of the Arbroath Town Board. We've seen how hard-working they are, the way the community really got behind this project, and I'd like to put on the record my thanks to everybody in the town who's done that, as well as my honourable friend, the member for Angus and Perthshire Glens, for his work on this. But going forward, will he ensure that he works with the Treasury to ensure that there's maximum flexibility for local communities in Arbroath but elsewhere in the UK to ensure that we bring these projects to full fruition?
Minister.
I think that's a very important point. We wanted to keep the promise made to the people of Arbroath. That's why I'm very pleased that we have been able to through the long-term plan for towns. But going forwards, as I've said to other colleagues, we want to see a longer-term, more allocative settlement that's driven by local people. As I say, as I stood in that church hall with board after board after board of feedback from local residents about what they wanted to see, that only firmed my resolve that they should be in charge, not us. So I came away with Arbroath Smokies. That's always worth a visit as well. But I was very, very impressed with what they were doing.
Smith.
Number 8, sir.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government is committed to tackling fuel poverty and delivering tenants warmer, cheaper homes. We're currently consulting on increasing minimum energy efficiency standards in the domestic private rented sector and are considering continuing supporting landlords to meet the new standards through consultation.
Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand the answer the Minister just gave, but when individual private landlords with just 1 or 2 properties are coming to my surgeries to say they're simply going to sell up and remove those properties from the private rented sector because they can't afford to bring properties up to EPCC. When the National Trust is leaving properties in the village of Bradnam completely empty because they can't afford to bring those rural homes up to EPCC. And when the charity Abbeyfield has closed its Prince's Risborough property, citing that they couldn't afford to bring it up to that EPCC level, displacing elderly and vulnerable residents. Will the Minister agree with me that if the government is going to bring new regulations in, it is equally incumbent on the government to help fund it?
Minister.
I thank the Minister for his question. Raising standards in the private sector, renter sector, could lift up to 550,000 people out of fuel poverty. And among the schemes, there are a number of schemes to support landlords to improve their properties, which they can look at eligibility through gov.uk, and in particular there are schemes like the boiler upgrade scheme offering £7,500 off the cost of heat pumps, and we look forward to working in partnership with the sector because we recognise it's an important sector.
Holly Billington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 13% of households in England, over 3 million people, are officially in fuel poverty. Does the Minister agree that the last Conservative government didn't just fail to meet their housing targets, but they also left a legacy of high household bills?
Yeah. Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for the question. We have a massive challenge that we have inherited, and we are working at pace to tackle these issues so that people can live safely and securely in their homes and that they don't have to face such high costs.
Shadow Minister David Simmonds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member for Mid Buckinghamshire has highlighted, simply putting people out of their homes is not a solution to fuel poverty. But given that the figures very clearly show that the cost of these upgrades in many cases massively exceeds the financial benefit either to the tenant or to the landlord, can the Minister assure the House, give the House her personal assurance that this project, this objective, is realistic and achievable?
Minister.
We recognise that it's important to get the balance right. The Renters Rights Bill will put in place new regulations to protect tenants. At the same time, as I have said, there are schemes to support those landlords that need support. And also the investment in a property is an important part of ownership, and improvements can lead to increases in property value and the attractiveness of lets to tenants.
Slinger.
Question number 9, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'll take questions 21 and 23 along with question 9. The Government are committed to delivering the biggest increase in social and affordable house building in a generation. In our first 8 months in office, we've announced £800 million in new funding for the Affordable Homes Programme. This top-up will support the delivery of up to 7,800 new homes, with more than half being social rent homes. We'll set out details of new investment to succeed the 2021-26 programme at the spending review.
Slinger.
I thank my honourable friend for his answer. What measures will his department consider to support councils that find themselves in viability negotiations with developers who are sometimes pushing down the quota of social homes and indeed affordable homes?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. I'm aware of several schemes in his constituency that are having viability issues. There is indeed financial support available. While the £500 million in new in-year funding for the Affordable Homes Programme announced that the budget is already oversubscribed as a result of significant demand from housing providers across the country, the further allocation of £300 million that we announced last month will help ensure more social and affordable homes are delivered. And I'd encourage both his local authority, if that's the case, and local social housing providers to bid for that money.
Mike Tubb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently visited Aylsham Village with Simmonds Homes in my constituency, and I was delighted to see the number of solar panels on the roofs across the estate. What's this government doing to ensure that we deliver solar panels on every roof, high levels of insulation and charging points on the driveways for new builds, including social housing?
Well, Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. The previous government, Mr. Speaker, to their credit, introduced changes to the building regulations that came into force in June 2022. Under these standards, new homes are being built with high-quality insulation and electric vehicle charging points. And those standards also encourage the use of solar panels or other forms of low-carbon technology, such as heat pumps. This government intends to amend building regulations later this year as part of the introduction of future standards that will set more ambitious energy efficiency and carbon emissions requirements for new homes.
Steve Witherden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The most recent data shows that nearly 11,500 people are currently stuck in temporary accommodation in Wales, unable to move on from homelessness due to a shortage of social housing and unaffordable private rents. Given the escalating need for affordable housing across the UK, what conversations has the department had with the Welsh Government to urgently address this crisis and collaborate on quickly increasing the availability of social homes?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. I understand well the pressures in Wales that he described so eloquently. We know that increasing the supply of social homes is a cornerstone of the Welsh Government's plans to prevent housing problems and homelessness. We speak regularly with our colleagues in the Welsh Government and will continue to work closely with them on our shared objective to get more social homes built by councils and housing associations.
Alberta Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Building more social housing and affordable housing was a principal promise made by Leicestershire County Council in the Lutterworth East development. Mr. Speaker, that's subject to Collins, so I don't want to go into that in any detail, but I do want to ask the Minister this very basic question. If a senior civil servant in the Housing Department gives a commitment to an MP to encourage the MP to drop an amendment to legislation, can the MP rely on the assurances given by senior civil servants in the department?
Minister.
I note the question the honourable member asks. What I would say, Mr. Speaker, is that we are grateful to all the civil servants who serve the government for acting with integrity. The Civil Service Code is clear that civil servants must act truthfully and cannot deceive or knowingly mislead ministers or Parliament. If the honourable gentleman has serious issues that he wishes to raise regarding civil servants, he can do so with the department's permanent secretary.
Jess Brown-Fuller.
Speaker. Chichester's planning policy dictates that 30% of all homes on new development should be for social and affordable housing. However, we've recently noticed a worrying trend where registered providers are refusing to take on those contracts at the smaller and medium-sized developments because they are favouring the larger developments. That's putting a lot of the social housing in Chichester at risk. So what is the Minister doing to ensure that registered providers continue to take on the smaller contracts that are delivered as part of mixed-use developments?
Minister.
I thank the honourable lady for her question. We know that registered providers are facing real challenges when it comes to their capacity, their headroom to be able to take on additional Section 106 units. She may be aware we set up through Homes England a clearing service to try and better match developers with those units that aren't being picked up. We're giving lots more thought as to what can be done in this area. I'm more than happy to speak to her about the options available to the government.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The building of more council houses throughout the UK is welcome news, especially in Ashfield. We've got 7,000 people on the waiting list. So does the Minister agree with me that when we're dishing these houses out, British-born, hard-working taxpayers should be prioritised?
Minister.
Well, I'd say to the honourable gentleman, they already are. There's very strict requirements in place when it comes to the allocation of social housing, and as he will well know, I'm not sure his council's got one in place, but local criteria can be imposed in terms of the amount of time someone needs to be resident in a particular area before they qualify for social rented housing.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every day another family contacts my office, and I'm sure other honourable members, homeless and placed in hostels, no functioning kitchens, no private bathrooms, miles away from their children's homes. What's worse is these placements are costing councils 3 times or more a permanent social homes, and so-called affordable homes are of no use to them at all. At the same time, new homes are being rejected by registered housing providers because their standards aren't high enough. So what is the government doing to progress the future home standards to ensure that the homes that are being built are not being rejected by the registered home providers because they're saying they're not good enough for them and they're going to have to retrofit them?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand the point the honourable lady is making. I'd refer her to my previous answer. The government does intend to bring forward, through changes to building regulations, future standards that will increase the energy efficiency and carbon emission requirements on new build homes, and I think will therefore give housing associations in particular who have got ahead of the changes, ahead of those standards, the comfort they need to start adopting those units.
Andrew George.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I will take questions 10 and 22 together. We of course recognise the challenges that local authorities are facing as demand increases for critical services. That's why the final settlement for 25-26 made available over £69 billion for local government in England, which is a cash increase of 6.8% in core spending power on 24-25. The most relatively deprived areas of England will receive 23% more per dwelling than the least deprived. Of course, spending decisions beyond this year are a matter for the upcoming spending review.
George.
I'm grateful to the Minister for that response. He'll be aware that since the Conservatives took control of Cornwall Council 4 years ago, it transformed that authority from being financially sound to staring down the barrel of bankruptcy. In cases of rural authorities like Cornwall, with urban levels of deprivations and a super-ageing population, what assurance can the Minister give that in any changes to the funding formula and plans for local authorities, that it will provide due regard to the clearly escalating costs of those local authorities, not least the NICS hike?
Well, he and all members of this House have our absolute commitment that we want to make sure that when we do the funding revision to the formula, that it takes into account all the matters that he has stated, because in the end, through the multi-year settlement that's intended to give stability, we have to make sure that councils are on their feet at the end of that. And of course, we recognise entirely that deprivation is a driver of cost, but also the cost of rural service delivery is in places too.
Kevin McKenna.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The 48th most deprived locality in England and 5 out of the 10 most deprived localities in Kent County Council are in my constituency of Sittingbourne and Sheppey. Yet Kent County Council struggles to understand the levels of deprivation and adequately resource them. Can the Minister assure my constituents that devolution and reorganisation of local government in Kent will ensure their needs are not ignored like this in the future?
Well, I won't comment on individual councils other than to say this is why local government reorganisation is so important. The two-tier system in too many parts of England is not working for local people. Aside from the fact that there is a two-tier premium, which means it's a more expensive way of delivering public services, for most members of the public, they have no idea which council is responsible for delivering which particular service. And it's right that we go through this reform, but he is absolutely correct too to say that the end has to work for local people too, and all the matters that he has covered are absolutely in our mind.
We come to Shadow Secretary of State, Kevin Holland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister mentions local government reorganisation. On the 5th of February, the Deputy Prime Minister stated that we are postponing elections for 1 year from May 25 to May 26. But the Minister, on the 17th of February, in a written parliamentary question, said new unitary government will be established or go live in 2027 or 2028. Can he confirm that these elections are not being postponed, they are being cancelled, and cancelled for up to 3 years, which means councillors will serve terms of up to 7 years? And will he confirm that the Deputy Prime Minister may have unintentionally misled the House and correct the record?
Well, I can start off by confirming absolutely that the Deputy Prime Minister did not mislead the House, and the opposition could do well without trying to muddy the waters, because they know more than anybody what local government reorganisation means. Why? Because in the last few years when they were in government, they postponed 17 sets of elections to allow reorganisation to take place. And of the 9 elections that are being postponed, 24 sets of elections will be taking place this year. So let's not allow this to be whipped up into something that it's not. We absolutely want to move at pace through reorganisation. We want to see proposals developed and presented early, and the sooner the better, to move to those shadow authorities that local people can elect to the new body that will exist, deliver public services in their area, and will be accountable. But to be clear, there is nobody going to benefit, whether it's council leaders in Conservative councils who have asked for this, or members of the public, if we confuse the matter more than it needs to be.
Dave Dougan.
Question 11, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Building regulations set fire safety standards for new development. Of course, building regulations and planning are a devolved matter, but in England, developers submitting planning applications for high-rise residential developments are required to submit a fire statement setting out fire safety considerations with their planning application. The local planning authority must also consult the Health and Safety Executive.
Dougan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. An architect constituent of mine alerted me to his concerns with Camden Council's approach to fire safety during an application to build a 400-guest underground hotel. At planning, London Fire Brigade expressed serious concerns that the proposed safety feature would be very difficult to maintain and extremely dangerous were they to fail. At a subsequent FOI,
London Fire Brigade's fire safety compliance team felt their concerns were ignored by Camden Council at planning. So what will the Minister do to commit to reviewing whether current regulations are sufficient to ensure local authorities in England properly attend to serious concerns raised by local fire brigades?
Minister.
I'm not sure I can comment on the individual application the Honourable Gentleman talks about, because of course that would have been subject to the planning process as established in law. But what I can say is one of the changes made by my right honourable friend, the Deputy Prime Minister, early on in our time in government was that approved document B is now a document that can be updated in real time very quickly. So if there are issues that are highlighted, we can make sure the regulations keep up with that pace and make sure that those buildings are safe.
Charters.
Speaker, last week Labour councillors in York delivered the first local plan. And are you ready for this, Mr Speaker? Since 1954. And they should be commended on that. But local authorities also need planning officers to make sure that applications can be processed quickly. Can the Minister update the House on plans to increase the number of planning officers?
Minister.
I remember, I think I'm going to say fondly, I remember very fondly, Mr Speaker, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act 2022 considerations. My honourable friend from Buckinghamshire also does too. And the member for York Central, if she's in her place, raised at every meeting that York had never managed a plan. So when I heard from the leader of York Council this morning that they had had that success, I was overjoyed. Of course, making those things real involves really good planners, and that's why we're really pleased to have made £46 million more available for planning capacity.
Shadow Minister David Simmonds.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We note that the Government has chosen of the Grenfell report recommendations not to take forward the one in respect of certification bodies on materials safety. Given also the previous Minister's reply or failure to reply at all to my questions on the new use of European standards in respect of fire performance, will the new Minister give his assurance to the House that we can be absolutely confident that the fire safety performance regulations in place are clear, robust and effective?
Minister.
There will be all of those things, which I believe is a shared goal. For clarity, we are absolutely taking the recommendations forward. As we stated last week, we don't think that the testing houses themselves ought to be under the purview of the single construction regulator, because that would mean that that regulator would essentially mark its own homework if there was a problem. I know that the colleagues opposite have a problem with this. More than happy to speak about that in greater detail. On the point on European standards, we're looking at that very closely, as you'll have seen in the Construction Products Green Paper. I have to say I think that alignment with them is probably a desirable goal, but that's part and subject to the consultation that's underway. But we're very, very clear. At the moment, the construction products regime does not cover enough construction products, there's not enough transparency, there's not enough accountability when things go wrong. So our desire, as has been expressed from this dispatch box, is a very high standards regime, and I look forward to working with colleagues opposite in service of that goal, which I know is a shared one.
Paul Coghlan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Question 13, please.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We all want to see our town centres thriving. I think it's one of those common things across colleagues that it's the thing that constituents raise with us. That's why we were delighted that at the budget the Chancellor confirmed that the long-term plan programme will be retained and reformed. That's working with 75 towns across the UK, providing each with £20 million to support their regeneration. This, of course, comes on top of the novation of high street rental auctions and the forthcoming community right to buy.
Speaker, I thank the Minister for his answer. I'm proud to have half of Morden Town Centre in my constituency. Morden's an area ripe for rejuvenation with fantastic transport links. However, like many town centres across the country, it's struggling. As one Labour councillor recently noted in the council chamber, despite years of promising to regenerate Morden, Labour-run Merton Council has failed to deliver. Just last week, they again put off doing anything, this time until at least 2027. Will the Minister meet with me to discuss why the Council has failed over the last 30 years to begin the rejuvenation and what support the Government can now give?
I'm very grateful for that invitation, which of course I'll take up. I mean, it feels like the experience that the Honourable Gentleman talks about is one that's not uncommon with the rest of the country. Certainly over the last 14 years, very little progress has been made in this regard. I know that Morden, for example, are bringing forward investment, some £300,000 to brighten and refresh the town centre, but I know that they, like he, want to see more. So I'll be very happy to sit down and to talk to them about that.
Mr Speaker, can I warmly welcome today's announcement of £20 million in community regeneration partnership money for Rochdale. That's money that will help further revitalise our town centre and the area around our train station, as well as expand our brilliant Hopwood Hall College. Doesn't this prove what can happen when you've got a Labour government working with a Labour council and a Labour MP to revive an area?
I absolutely do, and my honourable friend has been dogged almost to the point of, well, I won't say what's the point of, but dogged with me around securing that money for Rochdale. I know it's going to make a real difference. You know, we're delighted, despite this being yet another thing that wasn't funded by the previous government, that we've been able to secure that funding. I know it's going to have a great impact, and I look forward to visiting.
Number 15, please, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Government are committed to maintaining strong protections for our protected landscapes. We're clear that the scale and extent of development within such designated areas should be limited so that we're able to pass on their attractions and important biodiversity to future generations. National planning policy is clear that significant development within a national landscape should be refused, other than in exceptional circumstances where it can be demonstrated that development is in the public interest.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. West Dorset desperately needs actually affordable new housing for local people, especially key workers and young families looking to get on the housing ladder. But 70% of West Dorset falls within a protected national landscape form the AONB, meaning that rigid housing targets could lead to inappropriate developments that undermine the very character of this protected area. What discussions has the Department had with the local authorities in Dorset on adjusting housing targets to reflect the constraints of national landscape and the rural infrastructure challenges we have?
What I'd say to the honourable gentleman is that local authorities use the standard method to assess housing needs, but they can show evidence of any hard constraints in their areas, including protected landscapes, and those will be assessed by the planning inspectorate to judge whether the plan is sound. But we're clear, that, Mr Speaker, that local authorities should explore all options to deliver the homes their communities need, including maximising the use of brownfield land, working with neighbouring authorities, and, where appropriate, reviewing their green belt.
Daisy Cooper.
16, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. With permission, I'll take questions 16 and 19 together. The External Wall System 1 form is a tool developed by mortgage lenders to inform valuation and not a fire safety certificate. We are working very closely with the industry to encourage them to take a proportional approach to forms issued by Tri-Fire. Lenders who have signed the industry cladding statement should accept alternative evidence as part of mortgage applications, but if an individual does have concerns about the fire safety of their building, they should contact the person responsible for that building.
Cooper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm grateful to the Minister for that answer, but in an answer to a written parliamentary question last week, the Minister suggested that if leaseholders can't use an EWS1 fire safety certificate for progressing the sale and purchase of their homes, they should use the fire risk assessment instead. However, in many cases, including in my constituency of St Albans, both the EWS1 form and the fire risk assessment are most likely invalid, if not fraudulent. In those particular circumstances, could the Minister please set out what measures can be taken to prioritise those fire risk assessments for those leaseholders, and what can be done to protect those leaseholders from the additional costs of conducting another fire safety assessment after the one they conducted in good faith?
Minister.
If the building is in one of the government-backed schemes, such as the cladding safety scheme, then the fire risk assessment will have been audited, will have been quality assured, by the government, so that would give assurance there. If it is covered by the developer contract, it will have been audited by the department, so that ought to give cover as well. If neither of those things are the case, I'm more than happy to talk to the honourable lady about how to give the residents the surety so that they can evidence to lenders that their building is safe.
Dr Al Pinkerton.
Mr Speaker, honourable members across this House have raised concerns about the now expelled fire safety engineer Adam Kiziak following investigations into alleged fraud, signature fraud, and that includes in my constituency of Surrey Heath. From what I understand, a second fire engineer, Adair Lewis, has now disowned a further 20 Tri-Fire EWS forms that he alleges falsely bear his signature. Will the Secretary of State join with me in requesting an urgent police investigation into these allegations of fraud? And does she agree with me that her department must urgently reassess buildings that have been surveyed by Tri-Fire to protect residents from further uncertainty and market disruption?
Minister.
I would stress that the EWS1 form is an industry form rather than a fire safety one. And that for those buildings, that if they're in a government scheme, then any fire risk assessment has indeed been quality assured. If they're in the developer contract, then those schemes have been they've been audited as well. So that should give cover. I wouldn't want to speak about individual cases at the dispatch box. We, of course, believe that the quality of those assessments must be sacrosanct, that they must be done in good faith, and that's why, as part of our response to the Grenfell inquiry, we've made some significant commitments around standards in this area.
We now come to Topital Sabia Carr.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In the written ministerial statement on the 21st of November, this government committed to taking steps to bring the feudal system of leasehold to an end and reinvigorate commonhold to make it the default tenure for new flats. Today marks the first step in the transition with the publication of the Commonhold White Paper, which sets out the government's proposal for how reformed Commonhold model will operate based on the recommendations made by the Law Commission.
Sabia Carr.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The last government's disastrous changes to permitted development rights saw over 100,000 office and retail units converted into unsafe and unsuitable homes. In Southampton, it's left people still living with office wires hanging from their ceilings. Some have no windows, while for others, their homes are no bigger than a car park space. I welcome government's excellent progress in renters and leaseholders' rights, but can my right honourable friend go further and confirm when permitted development rights will be reviewed, tighter regulations imposed and, where necessary, unsafe conversions banned? Thank you.
So, that's far too long.
Well, my honourable friend's absolutely right to raise this, Mr Speaker. We acknowledge there's been criticism of some homes delivered through permitted development rights, particularly those that enable commercial buildings such as offices and shops to change use to residential, and the government is committed to keeping development rights under review.
Secretary of State Kevin Holding-Ray.
Help to Buy helped 350,000 young first-time buyers. The stamp duty discount helped 640,000 first-time buyers get on the housing ladder, with discounts are up to £11,000. Both now scrapped. Is the Secretary of State pulling up the housing ladder behind her?
Mr Speaker, it's staggering that the Shadow Secretary of State says that after so many people now can't get housing because of his government failed to meet their housing targets. We will have a mortgage guarantee scheme. We will build 1.5 million homes so that young people and people can get the houses they deserve.
Well, I'll try again. The manifesto promised to preserve the green belt, and then grey belt came along, which is supposed to be a few garage forecourts. Now it turns out that grey belt will mean 640 square miles of green belt are built upon, the size of Surrey. Is this simply another broken promise?
Well, again, Mr Speaker, I'll try again. Under the Tories, the number of homes approved on greenfield land increased nearly tenfold since 2009. Labour will be strategic in grey belt release, and we will have a brownfield first policy.
Mr Speaker, many families in my constituency of Blythe and Ashton are living in new housing estates where the developers have sailed off in the sunset, made their profits and left the state of the roads and the services in an unacceptable state and unadopted. Can the Minister say what steps the government might be able to take to push local authorities like Northumberland County Council into action, accept their responsibilities and adopt these estates?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. I well recognise the situation that he describes, but I also recognise the reluctance of local authorities to take on housing estates that have been built to a substandard. Mr Speaker, we have decided to consult this year on options to reduce the prevalence of private management of estates such as the kind he describes. We're also importantly going to implement new consumer protections for homeowners on private estates in the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act 2024.
Spokesperson Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Homelessness stats published last week showed rough sleepings increased for the third year in a row and are now 91% higher than 2021. Yet still, the Vagrancy Act has not been repealed and rough sleeping is still a criminal offence. In July 24, the Minister was asked for a progress report and advised consideration of relevant legislation was needed, but it's now more than 3 years since Parliament voted to repeal, so can she now give us a date when this will come into force?
Minister.
Thank you. We are taking urgent action to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping and have announced £60 million to tackle winter pressures, and we will update the House on progress in repealing the Vagrancy Act in due course.
Douglas McAllister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. 10,000 children are currently homeless in Scotland, with record levels of children in temporary accommodation. The number of social houses built by housing associations in Scotland is at its lowest level since Margaret Thatcher. Does the Minister agree with me that the SNP have taken Scotland in the wrong direction? And instead, we need to see the same bold action taken by this UK Labour government to build more homes replicated in Scotland with a Scottish Labour government in 2026?
I do agree with my honourable friend. Mr Speaker, last year as the housing emergency took hold, the SNP cut £200 million from the affordable housing budget. It was only as a result of Labour's record budget settlement that they were forced to reverse those cuts, but they're still not showing the adequate ambition that we need. The SNP must set out a real plan to reform planning and boost house building to meet their affordable housing targets.
Daniel.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In response to the minimum energy efficiency standards consultation for privately rented homes, landlord groups are saying that they would pass the cost of energy efficiency works on to tenants, despite the fact that this is the cost of bringing their properties up to basic minimum standards. Relying on council guidance that this shouldn't happen is too weak. So what additional measures will the Minister be taking to enforce this and ensure that it's private tenants already at the greatest risk of fuel poverty who will benefit and not landlords?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I referred to my answer earlier on to that precise question, and the Renters' Rights Act protects tenants from having the costs passed on to them.
Tom Rutland.
Speaker, many of my constituents face extortionate hikes in service charges with little in return, repairs not being carried out, poor service and a lack of transparency and accountability from their managing agent, Firstport. Can I ask the Minister to outline what they are doing to bring an end to the scandalous leasehold system that is ripping off leaseholders across the country?
Well, just to add, Mr Speaker, to the responses I gave earlier, we do intend to take action to provide leaseholders with those standardised service charge invoices, that transparency, so they can better challenge unreasonable rent hikes. But we also, Mr Speaker, need to, as I said, strengthen the regulation of managing agents, including those like Firstport, who clearly, from the feeling of the House, aren't performing the necessary services for their residents.
Stewart.
Welcome, though hundreds of millions of pounds extra for adult social care was in the budget, that actually the costs of NIC's rise and minimum wage will run into the billions, and therefore local authorities will in fact be worse off than they were prior to the budget in terms of tackling social care. Could you confirm yes or no?
That's right. Minister.
That's exactly the reason why there's £3.7 billion of new money for adult social care in the budget.
Lord Hatton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Eden Portland is an exciting proposal for my community. Much like the Eden Project in Cornwall and Morecambe, it would be a hub for education and ecology. If delivered, it would boost investment and create well-paid jobs. I know ministers agree that this could be a real success story, so will they meet with myself and the team at Eden Portland, alongside colleagues at DCMS and the Council, to discuss how we can deliver this exciting project?
Minister.
Yes. I welcome the exciting Eden Portland proposals, and I enjoyed meeting with the honourable gentleman to hear further from him. It's clear they would be great for the area's economic regeneration, for tourism in the region, and support greater understanding of biodiversity loss. And colleagues in DCMS are working closely with the proposers and my officials in the department, but I'd be very happy to involve myself in whatever way is useful.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. Langdon Road, Mount Nessing Road in Billericay, Noak Bridge. These are all planning proposals which have previously been rejected because of the green belt aspect of them, but are now being reconsidered under grey belt. Will the Minister urgently meet with me, Billericay Action Group, and also some of the local councillors to look at the issues around grey belt, where perhaps it's not being used in the way that the government originally intended?
Well, local authorities can be clear about how it should be used because we released planning policy guidance last week to give them a better sense of where grey belt is appropriate to be released and where it can be brought forward for development.
Come on. Dr. Rosanna Allen-Khan.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Far too many renters get a terrible deal living in cold, mouldy, substandard homes charged at eye-watering rates by landlords. I am proud of this government's Renters' Rights Bill, and while this legislation is welcome, too many are still paying extortionate prices for really shoddy properties. Can the Secretary of State assure me that the Government is taking more steps to make renting affordable again?
Minister.
I can assure my honourable friend of that fact, as well as succeeding where the previous government failed and finally abolishing Section 21 no-fault evictions. The Renters' Rights Bill will empower tenants to challenge unreasonable within-tenancy rent increases. But we also need to boost supply, Mr Speaker, and that's why we've set a hugely ambitious milestone as part of our plan for change of building 1.5 million safe and decent homes in this Parliament.
Tim Farrell.
In the Lake District and in the Dales of Cumbria, average house prices are around 20 times average household incomes. Will he therefore try to tackle this issue by making sure there is a specific, unappealable designation of social housing only developments that national park authorities and local councils can enforce?
Minister.
Well, we do want to see far greater use of rural exception sites in particular, but I'm more than happy to sit down with the honourable gentleman. I think we are all ready to discuss short-term lets, but also to discuss this issue.
Mr Speaker, I've recently received a number of complaints from my constituents about leasehold managing agents. These include unacceptable long delays for repairs.
Order! This is totally unfair when the member's speaking to block the vision of the site of the church. Please. Philbrook.
These include unacceptable long delays for repairs and exorbitant costs at Greenmount Court in Smithills, despite spiralling fees, poor transparency and little to no communication for the agent. What steps is the Minister taking to deliver a fairer deal for existing leaseholders and hold poorly performing managing agents to account?
Well, Mr Speaker, we do need to balance speed with care, because we're not going to make the mistakes that the previous government did and pass legislation with flaws in it that require us to therefore fix and delay reform for leaseholders. But we are going to, as soon as possible, introduce the provisions of the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act that allow us, as I said, to bring in transparency around service charges to allow leaseholders to better challenge unreasonable increases. And we do intend to strengthen the regulation of managing agents.
Thank you, Mr
Speaker. Thank you. On the 8th of February, the court, a Grade 2 listed landmark in Horley, my constituency, burnt down in mysterious circumstances. I did meet with the 3 local councillors on Friday, Councillor Cooper, Hearn and Reid, to discuss this. Without requiring the Minister to comment on this specific case, will she confirm that where listed buildings are destroyed without permission, there should be a presumption that they are rebuilt brick by brick as they were before the destruction?
Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm sorry to hear about that particular case, and I'm happy to meet with him to get the details, but absolutely, listed buildings are a very important part of our landscape.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. At nearly every single one of my advice surgeries, leaseholders in Stratford and Bow have told me appalling stories of disrepair, high service charges and no accountability from management agents, years after broken promises of reform by the Conservative government. I'm pleased about today's announcement on leasehold reform for new builds, but can the Minister give my constituents concrete action on what existing leaseholders can be assured of?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, the publication of the Common Hold White Paper today does mark the beginning of the end of the feudal leasehold system. We are going to succeed where the previous government failed and bring that system to an end, but we are absolutely determined to provide immediate relief for leaseholders suffering from unreasonable and unfair charges at present.
Question, Nick Mohammed.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to gently follow up on a critical request for urgent help that I made in November last year. In September 2023, Kirklees Council temporarily closed Dewsbury Sports Centre for safety reasons due to RAC. The centre remained closed until the 5th of November 2024, when the Council unilaterally decided to permanently close the centre without investigation. I raised this issue with the Secretary of State for DCMS, and I've written to the Prime Minister and the Treasurer and the Chancellor for assistance. Will the Deputy Prime Minister facilitate an update to me on this issue?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr Speaker, the member makes a very important point around safety and RAC in our public buildings, and we're absolutely committed to do all we can despite the legacy that was given to us by the previous government, and I'll make sure he gets a meeting with the Safety Minister.
I'll let the front benches change over.